Good morning, Tony Park. Good evening, Tony Park. Welcome to Life in a Garden Online. It's fantastic to have you here with us this afternoon, evening, morning thing that's going on transcontinental. Are you well?
I'm well, and thanks very much for having me, Mandy.
Such a pleasure. We've talked about doing this quite a few times, and I'm glad we've actually finally got it right.
We have, yeah.
Tony, I want to just jump straight in because I know that you want to have another beer. Just as a matter of interest, everybody, the chat box is open, and if you have a question for Tony, please post it in the chat box and I'll relay the question to him. So I want to jump straight in and ask you, why does an Australian write about South Africa and Africa in general as opposed to his own backyard?
Yeah, it's a good question, Mandy, and it was never part of any grand plan or grand designs. I mean, I'm in Sydney in my home now. And I grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney, in quite a poor part of the city, and there was nothing in my background or DNA that would suggest I would ever get to South Africa or Africa, and let alone write about it. I'm sometimes asked if I'm from Southern Africa originally, if I have some family connection. No, I don't. But the one thing I knew in life from the time I was a very small boy was that the only thing in life I wanted to do was to write a book. And I didn't know what I wanted to write about. All I knew is I wanted to write fiction. That was my aim in life. And as I got older, I left school. I worked. I only really liked doing English. I only really liked writing and the written word when I was at school. I was no good at anything else. And like a lot of people, I thought, well, I want to write a book and I want to get serious about it. And I worked as a journalist. I worked in public relations. So I was working with the written word. But I found a couple of big obstacles to writing a book, and they were time and place. So having enough time in amongst whether you're working or raising a family or whatever you do, to also sit down and write a book was a big ask. And the other thing, when I did try and start writing, was I found that it was difficult to sort of pin down where I wanted to set a book, in terms of time and place and what it was going to be about. And I chipped away for many, many years and didn't really achieve this dream that I'd had. And then around, I am getting to the answer to your question, but around the mid-90s, I took a fairly dramatic step with the support of my wife. I left my job. I had a good full-time job in a PR company, and I left that to try and write a book. And with her support, with her paying the bills and looking after us, I wrote a book. And I actually wrote a book set in the outback in Australia in the Second World War. And when I finished the manuscript and read through it, it was without a doubt the worst book I had ever read in my entire life. Not surprisingly, it didn't get published. I shouldn't say that because during lockdown I might dust it off and re-release it. But I made a number of mistakes that first-time authors make. I wrote a book that I thought other people would want to read. And I wrote a book. I had tickets on myself. I thought, people overseas in England and America and whatever might want to read this book. And what do they want to read? I'm an Australian. They probably want to read a book set in the outback, like Crocodile Dundee or the Thornbirds or one of these other great Australian stories. But I'd never been to the outback. I had no affinity, very little affinity with the Australian bush. And it wasn't surprising that book didn't really work, and it wasn't particularly enjoyable to write. But shortly after that, in fact, while that was happening, my wife and I went on what was supposed to be a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Africa, to South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Botswana on a safari holiday. We're going to
When was that?
Tick that box. That was 1995. And instead of being a once-in-a-lifetime trip, I don't know what happened. I don't know whether we drank something or breathed something in or were bitten by something, but we were hooked during that first trip. And decided that we would want to come back. So we went back again and again every year. And so about 3 years after I'd had that first attempt to write a novel which failed, I had another try, but this time it was on an extended trip that we did around Southern Africa. And I wrote a novel set on a tour. We were self-driving, but a longish trip around Southern Africa. And now I found I was writing about a part of the world that I knew a little bit about, not a lot, but I was getting to know, and that I was absolutely smitten with, I think addicted to. And hopefully it showed through in the book, because that book did get published. It was my first novel, Far Horizon. And my publisher said to me in Australia, she said, you can write the Africa books. And so here I am 18 books later writing the Africa books, basically.
That's fantastic. How much time do you actually spend here? Well, not this year, clearly, but
Not
under
this
normal
year. Yeah,
circumstances.
this is the longest I've been away from Africa in 18 years. I worked it out today. The last time I was away from Africa this long, I was at war. So I went to Afghanistan with the Australian Army in 2002, and that was the longest I'd been away from Africa. So generally, my wife Nicola and I spend half of the year here in Australia and half of the year in Africa, mostly Southern Africa. We have a house in South Africa. We love South Africa. We have a house on the edge of the Kruger Park, and we use that as the base for our travels. And we come and go a bit, but over the course of the year, we will spend pretty well spot on 6 months of the year in Africa and 6 months of the year in Australia.
You can't even say you come here for the summer months. I mean, we share the same seasons.
Well, I mean, the thing is that we love the continent at all times of the year. And I mean, the other thing too, there's practicalities. I mean, we live in the Lowveld, on the edge of the Kruger Park. It's beautiful in winter, but it's also incredibly busy. So sometimes we'll go back to Australia, say June or July, because my wife is working and that's a busy time for her work. So we're lucky in that we have the luxury of coming and going a bit, and maybe coming at some of the quieter times of the year. And I know quite a few people shy away from our part of South Africa in the summer, but we love the summer, the heat, the rains, the bird life that comes in. And we do sort of spread our time across the year. And we consider ourselves incredibly fortunate. We've got a lot of South African friends who've emigrated to Australia, and they have moved here for very good reasons, and sometimes because they've got family here. And but there is not one of them that I know who doesn't, after a beer or a glass of wine, saying, "But I miss the bush," and that's what I miss. And that's why one of the big attractions for us is living in the South African bush and traveling to neighbouring countries and visiting the game parks. Of course, it's more than that, but I think one of the reasons that I think my wife Nicola and I are quite lucky is that we not only live in two different countries or two different continents, but we live two very different lifestyles. So here in Sydney, I'm in my 2-bedroom flat apartment in Sydney. So we live a very city existence. And then we're lucky because when we go back to South Africa, we're living in the bush surrounded by leopards and hyenas and zebras and giraffes. So we have a lovely contrast, not just in the countries, but in the lifestyle we lead. And again, we don't take it for granted, particularly not this year. We consider ourselves incredibly fortunate and lucky.
You said that you spent time in Afghanistan. Do you come from a military background at all?
Well, I mean, in my family, on my mum's side and my dad's side, there is a history of service in the military and, in the previous wars. I had an uncle who was very formative in my life, who was in the Air Force. So I joined the Australian Army Reserve, the part-time army, at the age of 17, and possibly with a view to joining the permanent force. But I think the Army Reserve was a good fit for me, and I was in for 34 years until I finished with them a couple of years ago. So I did get to see a bit of overseas service, a brief period in East Timor where we had peacekeeping operations. And then, I was sent to Afghanistan in 2002 for 6 months as an Army public affairs officer, which was my job, similar to my civilian job in public relations and journalism. But I went with the Army. So it's been a big part of my family's history, and I think it's fair to say it comes through in the books as well too. I mean, several of the books have characters who have some experience in military operations around the world as well.
Female protagonists, is that a big feature in your books?
Yeah, look, I think,
as opposed to is that?
Yeah, well, one of the truisms they say when you write, people are full of advice for people who want to write. They say, write about what you know. That's a good thing. I think for me, it was write about something I was interested in and passionate about, which over the years was this growing addiction or love for Africa, and a passion for wildlife and the environment, which grew out of my visits to Africa. I never really thought about conservation and wildlife and stuff before I went to Africa. But then when I look at the sort of books that I liked reading, I liked reading thrillers, and I tended to like books that had a strong female lead. I was a big fan of Ken Follett. You always have very strong female characters in his books. And so as I started writing, I thought, well, I like that. And it is good advice to sort of write about what you know, write about what you like. And this book, Last Survivor, brings back probably my most frequently recurring character, who's a female mercenary by the name of Sonia Kurtz, who's a Namibian-born woman from German descent. And she's had some military experience, like other people I've met from Southern Africa. She's had service with the British Army. And so she comes back. So yeah, and even in a few of the other books, I've got a detective, Van Rensburg, who's coming back in the next book. So I like books with a strong female lead. I don't write for a particular market or audience, but I will admit I was a little bit surprised after the first couple of books were released, and my publishers said, "Oh, the majority of your readers are women," and I said, "Well, I didn't know that. I kind of thought I was writing books for middle-aged white men like myself, but it turns out my readership is far more diverse than that. I'm very proud to say. And so I don't write for women, but if more women than men want to read the books, that's fine. I think it's probably pretty close to 50-50. But yeah, so that's what I like. And I think the other thing with writing is that if you're not enjoying the writing process, number one, there's probably no point in doing it. And I get a kick out of writing, a strong female lead like Sonia, who reappears in this book, but with a fairly strong support cast. And by strong, I mean, very opinionated sort of characters. But she's a joy to write, because if she was a male character doing the things she does and saying the things she says, I think a lot of readers would probably say she's a psychopath.
Yes, because crossed my mind.
Because a strong, independent woman and a single mum, people say, go girl. Good on her. So I get a good
boyfriend has reaction. A better relationship with her daughter than she does.
Yeah. She has terrible choice in men as well.
Tony, the Cycad and Gun Club, will they be making a reappearance? Because I kind of felt, David Balducci's got that, the Camel Club. And I was reading your book, I thought, shit, this is kind of like, these people could definitely reappear at a later stage in another book.
Yeah, it's funny you asked that, Mandy. I have been thinking about it, because look, this is a funny subject, this one about Cycads, because it was something that, I got interested in, and it's a serious issue, and I wanted to give it some coverage. And I've kind of had some good feedback early from the book, and that people said, well, I don't think, how can you make story about plant smuggling interesting? And at the back of my mind when writing this story is, I need a bit of action and a bit of adventure in there. Yeah. And then I thought, well, who are these people who are interested in Cycad? I've got a friend who's very interested in Cycads, and the characters, like all the books I've written, I don't have a plot or anything. They kind of grew on me as I started writing. And I had a lot of fun writing this book. So yes, I think my quirky collection of gun-toting people in sensible shoes could quite possibly make an appearance again in the future.
Yeah, because I thought they were fantastic characters, and they definitely deserved another outing at least.
I think so.
Before we go further, could you give, I don't know if people have read your book yet. I mean, I finished it last night. Could you give us a basic sort of sum up of the synopsis without giving away too much?
Sure. So the book is, at its heart about the illegal trade in cycads, plants that I knew absolutely nothing about, but I did learn a number of interesting facts. I'll just quickly go through. Cycads are amongst the most endangered living organisms in the world today, particularly the southern African Encephalatos family of cycads. And so the premise of Last Survivor is that the rarest cycad in the world, thought to be extinct, is rediscovered, and it's worth so much money that a lot of people want to get their hands on it, including some terrorists. If you think that's a bit far-fetched, I did some research by talking to a very interesting guy I know from Zimbabwe, who's been training anti-poaching rangers in Mali in Northwest Africa, where poaching is occurring, where desert elephants are killed for their tusks and other smuggling and wildlife crimes go on, and it's all being done to fund terrorism, to fund extremist terrorism. So the most valuable cycad in the world, worth a fortune, as it would be if such a thing was discovered, is potentially being used to fund a terrorism attack. And one of the members of the Pretoria Cycad and Firearms Appreciation Society, a fictitious organisation, is accused of stealing the plant. And so the story is a bit of a chase to find out what's happened to this missing rare cycad, and what is going to happen to Joanne Flack, the woman who has been accused of stealing the rare cycad from under the noses of the Cycad and Firearms Appreciation Society.
Okay, so that, and it's a very exciting book, and it's one of those things when you're reading fast because the action's happening fast. And you find that you do that when you read, like there's this gunfight going on and this is happening, and then like you're actually reading it like at that speed and it's going on in your head at the same time. Are you that person?
Yeah, it's fun. Yeah, it's fun to write like that because, you know, as I said, I don't have a plot when I write. I just make it up as I go along. And I think one of the challenges in writing is that, like I said, I think I said before, you've got to love it. Number one, you can't go into writing a book thinking I'm going to make a fortune, because you're probably not, unless you're Baldacci or someone like that. But it's like any job. I think if you love what you're doing, then that's the secret to it. And I think part of that is keeping yourself motivated and interested. And so I find myself that if I'm writing and I'm starting to, nod off a little bit, something's going terribly wrong. So a lot of what I'm doing is trying to keep myself engaged and keep myself interested. And I do write quickly, I think, from what I know of author standards, but I produce a pretty rough first draft that then needs quite a bit of editing and work. But yeah, I think the pace at which I write is probably reflecting, hopefully, the sort of book that I want to read, and hopefully I'm trying to keep other people engaged, just as I'm trying to keep myself engaged as I go along.
You actually answered when you spoke now, but my one next question is whether you're a plotter or a pantser. So clearly you write from the seat of your pants, but how do you keep track of your characters?
Oh, how do I keep track of the characters? Yeah, good question. I mean, the interesting thing is that the first book that I wrote, which I mentioned, which didn't see the light of day, I had plotted meticulously. And that's because I read a couple of books about how to write before I left work. I wasn't completely unprepared. I left work to, risk everything to try and write a book. And the books that I read said that you had to have a plot. And so I did. And what I found was the process of writing that first book, where I plotted everything, was not an enjoyable process. I remember now thinking, this is so hard. There's all this work that you have to do even before you start the creative process, before you start writing. And how can you think up all these people? And how can you think up all this story in advance? Well, I had to. But then it was a matter of filling in the blanks in the plot, to flesh it out. And it was not an enjoyable process. And I think it was reflected in the final product that came out. So when we were having that first long trip around Africa in 1998, our third visit to Southern Africa, we also were on a holiday where, because we had the luxury of a bit of time, my wife had actually left her job at that time as well. She was in between jobs. We had no plan. We bought an old Land Rover and we just cruised around. We had no idea where we were going next. So each morning we'd wake up and go wherever we felt like going. And what I did when writing my second book, the first one that got published, Far Horizon, was I took the same approach. I thought, well, I can't think up a plot. Clearly, I'm not capable of it. So I'll just make it up as we go along. And as our real travels progressed each day, so too did my fictitious tour, which pretty well followed the course of that trip all around Southern Africa when I was writing that book. And that's why I still write today. So wherever I am, whatever I'm doing that day tends to sort of go into the book. And keeping track of characters is the same, because I was no more capable of plotting a book than I was of thinking up a character. And to me, it seems very artificial to go into writing saying, I'll have a little. People do this, it's good advice if you can work that way. You have a little dossier, you have a little file on each character, and you know everything about them and what they look like, and have a little picture of them and what their family background and history is. But that's not like real life. I meet you, we've met tonight, we're talking, I get to know a little bit about you. The longer we know each other, the more time we spend in each other's company, the more we get to know each other. And that's how I write my characters. I don't know when I start writing a book who the baddie is, because I don't want to. I want to surprise myself further down the track. And I don't know if the person's going to be likable or not likable, and sometimes they can appear likable, but they're not really, and that's real life. So that's the way I write. And I find that's just what works for me. But how do I keep track of them? It's very difficult. And so, as I was saying before, that first draft that I end up with after about 5 months or so is very rough. And a character that starts off with blonde hair and blue eyes in chapter 1 can end up with brown hair and brown eyes in chapter 20 with a different name or something like that. So there's a lot of ironing out that needs to be done if you write by the seat of your pants, as opposed to having everything meticulously plotted out. But I'm not taking away from those people who can plot a novel in advance. In fact, I'm often very envious of them and wish I could do that.
Your editor must love you working like that.
Well, I think that probably the time you save by not having a plot, you spend in fixing up down the track. So there's no shortcuts in this business, I don't think. But yeah, and I'm lucky I have very good editors as well too. And my wife, certainly, she's the first reader, and she picks up a hell of a lot of stuff, a hell of a lot of areas in my books. So.
It's nice that your books has no loose ends either, that you actually tied up all the little bits and pieces, because so many authors you read just leave like one little aspect hanging, and it's usually an animal somewhere.
Yeah.
I remember reading a Margie Orford book, and in one of the scenes there's a dog tied to the back of a bakkie, and nothing in the book ever tells you what happened to that dog. And it's the only thing I remember about the book. You're like, what happened to the dog? Is the dog still tied to the bakkie?
I'm a huge fan of Margie's books, but I've got my editors will sort of say, they'll pick up on stuff like that, and they'll say, but what happened about this? And I said, well, I've forgotten all about that. And I think the risk, if you talk about tying things up, it is important, because if you don't have a plot, you'll find yourself, I'll be writing a book and I'll go off on a tangent, and at some point I'll sometimes think, I don't need that anymore, so I've got to find a way of closing that off and getting back to the main action. And if people are being nice, they'll say to me, read the book, oh, that was a very clever little misdirect. And I'll say, no, that was me going up the garden path and getting lost, basically. And then having to find a way to tie it off and get back to the thing. A very clever misdirect. No, it was just me being absent-minded, basically.
How much research goes into, clearly from your book that you said you knew nothing about cycads.
Nothing.
Why did you pick cycads in the first place?
I had a friend in Zimbabwe who was a very keen cycad collector, and she'd been living on a farm, and like some of my other friends in Zimbabwe, they were kicked off their farm, and during the land redistribution process up there, and along with all the other, if you have to leave your home, what do you take? You take your passport and your valuables and the family silver and the cars and whatever you can get away with. And she had a couple of truckloads of plants, and I was like, why? I know you love your plants. And she said they're worth a fortune, and then she started explaining to me the value of cycads to collectors, and then she explained to me the illegal market in cycads, and the scale of this lucrative trade, which is worth millions, perhaps billions of rands every year, and it's a multinational, and in its own way quite sinister trade. So I learned a lot from my friend, and then one of the things I do when I research is I don't I get an idea for a story. And from the conversation I had with her, I had a pretty good start. And a bit of a feeling for the scale of the trade and what people got up to. And so then I tend to write my story as I see it going. And then because it's very hard to do too much research when you don't know the story at the start. So when I get to the end of the first draft, and now I go through and my wife goes through and I iron out, that's the best way to describe it. I iron it into some sort of shape. Then I can go back and see the gaps in my knowledge. And so when I then do my research, the way I research is I find experts. So if I don't use the internet, if I use the internet, it's just to stalk people. It's just to find.
I do that all the time.
Stalking is great. There's nothing wrong with it. So I was able through the internet. Well, I have a good friend, Michelle Hoffmeyer, who used to work as a botanist in the Kruger Park. She used to run the Kruger Park nursery. Not only does she know everything about plants, she's a good go-to person. She has a wonderful network of friends. And so she was able to point me towards some people. So I got in touch with a couple of people from SANBI, the South African National Biodiversity Institute, experts in cycads and the trade in cycads. A guy called Pakamani Zaba from Kirstenbosch, and then I got onto an academic from the University of Stellenbosch, and then I could go to them not saying, I think this is a good tip for writers if people are interested. If you want to research something, don't go to a cycad expert and say, tell me everything about cycads. I want to know everything there is to know about cycads, because it's impossible. And also I'll end up getting something wrong. But if I can go to an academic or somebody in government, in the government regulatory side of things, and say, tell me the name of the most valuable cycad and tell me what it looks like. So I'm asking very specific questions to then fill in the gaps in my knowledge. So I guess the short answer, the summary of that long answer is I research retrospectively. I go back and find out just what I need to. And then if I'm lucky, and I was lucky, those experts or one or two of them will agree to read the story. It's funny when you, just one funny thing, you talked about the Cycad and Firearms Appreciation Society. Well, I mean, my friends in Australia say, is this real? I say, well, I've got a lot of friends in South Africa that have guns, so I don't think there's any problem with that. But one of the ideas for the society came when, after talking to my friend, she gave me some magazines to read. I wasn't serious about research, but I read the minutes of the AGM for the Cycad Society of Rhodesia from 1979. And at the start of the AGM, at the minutes, it said, members will please check firearms at the door. So that's where the idea for the sort of heavily armed grannies and grandpas came from.
They literally are grannies and grandpas, aren't they?
I pictured them all putting their R1s in an umbrella stand or something like that on the way into the meeting.
Just hang your Uzi on the back door.
Exactly.
And what about, well, you've got 1,000 miles. What's his first name? I can't remember his first. Andrew, 1,000 miles. Where does a character like that come from? Does he feature in your other books?
Well, he does. He is someone, that name, I think we might chat about it later, is someone who's paid to have their name in the book. You get a few things swirling around in your mind, and the luxury of not plotting is you can cherry pick. I was talking to my friend from Zimbabwe, who I mentioned before, who is training the anti-poaching rangers in Mali. And I thought, that sounds like a great idea for a book. But I didn't know I could tie it into cycads until I started writing this one. I thought, I'll use that. So there's a scene in Mali. There's a Malian connection in the book. So I took that. And the other thing I remembered is, look, I'm a bit of a plane spotter, I like aircraft and military stuff and whatever. And it's not around anymore. But if you remember the Thunder City operation that was down in Cape Town, guy Mike Beachy Head used to have a number of old Cold War jet fighters down there that he would take flips in. I remember thinking, wouldn't it be great to put something like that in a book? And so I've got this pilot, Andrew Miles, in the book, who is the owner of a vintage Hawker Hunter jet aircraft. And I thought, what better aircraft to support a bunch of Omars and Opars with guns than a 1950s, 1960s Cold War jet fighter. And so I had this idea that it'd be nice to put that into a book sometime. So you can cherry pick all these ideas and you think, well, what have they all got to do with Cycads? Nothing, basically. But one of the great things about writing fiction is you can pretty well do whatever you want to. The other interesting thing that I found, though, in doing some research, in fact, not research, it was during a webinar I was on recently. You know, the premise for this book is that a female encephalatos woodii cycad is somehow discovered. And I thought, I'm pushing the boundaries here, you know. But a couple of people I spoke to said, you know, it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that there could be this plant that doesn't exist anymore. They're not without hope that there might be one somewhere in the bush. And then I was on this webinar with a lady from an organization called CREW, which is about endangered wildflowers in South Africa. And she mobilizes citizen scientists around South Africa to go out into the bush and the fynbos and carry out transects and count all the plants and work out what's there. In recent years, they have rediscovered 16 species of endangered wildflowers that were thought to be extinct. So you never know, you know, you can, as a writer, you can, maybe it's possible.
Fair enough. I just want to answer a couple of questions here. Sandy asked, what type of music do you like and who's your favorite performer?
Wow, that's a tricky question. Yeah, that's a really tricky question. I like old stuff. That's my 1954 Row AMI jukebox there, and I've got a 1968 Rockola one in the lounge room. So I like old stuff from the 50s, 60s, and a little bit of 70s. And I have I think you'll call it eclectic taste in music. So a bit of country, a bit of rock and roll. But I only ever liked singles, you know, 45s, 7-inch singles. I never bought albums. And so that's why I have jukeboxes, because I've got lots of different records that reflect my different taste in music. But I think there was a little bit of 60s stuff going through my mind when I was writing the Cycad Society characters, I think, as well too.
And then another one from Karen. What sparked your love of books and the written word? Was it family or through school? And is there a culture of reading in Australia? It's a double barrel.
Karen, what a great question. Yeah. My mum got me reading at a very early age. And it's, you know, I don't have kids, but I think it's the best gift that a parent or a grandparent can give a kid is a love of books, because, you know, we learn so much and it's just expanded my horizons and you know, but kids have to be taught that, you know, so that's where it comes from. The interesting thing in Australia, it's quite different to South Africa. You know, I learned a lot, you know, being published in both countries. Fiction massively outsells non-fiction in Australia, but in South Africa, non-fiction outsells
fiction. It's completely the opposite.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So while I sell more books in Australia, I probably have a better market share, I guess, in South Africa, which I'm very grateful for, you know, and I'm really grateful to have been, you know, kind of accepted in South Africa, because I do see it as my home, or at least my other home. So there is a culture of reading in Australia. Look, I'll say on the line, you know, I mean, I think one of the problems we have in Australia, and I don't know where it comes from, is we, you know, when it comes to fiction, I think we're always looking for the next big thing from overseas. You know, I think the market is kind of fixated on the prize, you know, the latest literary prize or something like that, and people read what they think they should be reading, you know, from overseas. There's perhaps a little bit of a cultural cringe. Whereas what I find in South Africa is the reason that people, like, you know, in the past, like Wilbur Smith has done well, and John Gordon Davis, an author who's my favorite author, did well, is because people in South Africa like reading about South Africa, which is why you have Dion Meyer doing so well in crime and Margie Orford, because we like reading about where we live. And in Australia, there's a bit of this sort of cultural cringe where we probably rather read about what someone's up to in, the UK or Scandinavia in, Sweden or somewhere like that, or Norway or something, rather than our own home market. So I benefit from that in South Africa, the fact that there's a lot of people who say, I'd like to read a book set in the Kruger Park. And I'd say, well, that's good, because I want to write a book set in the Kruger Park. So we don't have that cultural cringe kind of thing. I think we're passionate about our own country and our own politics and what's happening there. So yeah, that's a really good question from Karen. Yeah, really good. I haven't had a question like that. Yeah, so that's a really good one. It gets me thinking. Thank you.
She says it's a great answer. My mother also encourages us to read, and I agree. I cannot stand literary snobs. The interesting thing about South African crime fiction is it's a fairly recent genre in this country, because up until 20 years ago, it wasn't, even maybe 15 years ago, there's a lot of anti-apartheid stuff and a lot of apologist stuff. A lot of our stuff is very heavily politicized. So there's a whole lot of that going on as well. So crime fiction is, as I say, a very sort of more recent genre. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so popular in this country. Because it is different.
And I like reading about it as well too. I mean, there's a great, I honestly, I think between them, Dion and Margie, who you mentioned, are probably the best crime writers in the world, as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, and so it's great. I'll tell you the other thing, and it does hark back to Karen's question, is that reading there isn't the literary snobbery. There's literary fiction. I'm not going to go down that path. But what I find in South Africa, particularly in the writing festivals, Kingsmead in Joburg and Stella and Franschhoek, in the Cape, is that they're very accessible. There's a place for people like me there who are writing, action thriller novels, just as there is a place for people writing literary works and a place for people writing political books. So it's great, and I think, probably here in Australia, those sort of similar festivals are more aimed at the other, the other end of the market. The other interesting thing that I'm finding in South Africa, which I think is really, really good, is that my readership is becoming much more diverse. And by that, I mean ethnically diverse, and people from all walks of life and all parts of the country and all different backgrounds. And I think that's great, not just as someone who's in the business of writing books and hopefully selling books, but it also kind of forces me to keep an eye on my characters and make sure that they reflect the diversity of the country as well too. And that I don't just fall into
very well in The Last Survivor. I mean, you have quite a broad spectrum of different characters, including Tandi, who is an ex-roadie or a Zimbabwean, shall we say.
And I think I haven't done that, to sort of say I need to cover off that side of the market, but I did it because, the longer I live in South Africa, the more broad and diverse my basis of friends is, and my experiences and my knowledge of other cultures becomes, because I'm interested in broadening my horizons, not for writing, because I just am, I want to be, a citizen of South Africa, and I want to learn as much as I can about the different cultures and the different parts of the country and the politics and everything like that. So I think as your own experience broadens, hopefully that can influence your writing as well too.
Are you aware when you're writing about the social issues that you're bringing into the book, or is it do they just kind of happen in the book, or do you deliberately bring them in? Poaching, endangered species, war, terrorism, finances, that kind of stuff?
Look, I think you got to walk a line. You have to balance so many things when writing. It's like politics as well too. You don't want to use a book. I'll get to your answer. I've got to think my way through to answer the question. One thing I'm conscious of not doing when I write a book is using it as a soapbox for my own personal views. I have my own views on politics, and I have my own views on conservation and the rhino debate and poaching and stuff like that. So I have to be careful not to fall into the trap of using my books to push my views. But I think what I also want to do is, because I'm generally writing contemporary fiction, is to make the books as real as I can. So, for example, if I write a book about Zimbabwe, and I've written a few books about Zimbabwe, I can't not talk about politics. I can't. It's impossible.
No, you can't.
Because
No.
politics impacts every man, woman, and child in that country every single day of the week, whereas it doesn't here in Australia. You know, it doesn't really matter who's in power here, but it certainly matters in Zimbabwe. So you can't write a contemporary thriller without touching on politics. And you know, so I think the same when it comes to things like crime and whatever. Walking the balance means I don't want to write a book that is so confronting or horrific that people will say, you know what, I don't want to read about that stuff when I'm reading for pleasure. I want a bit of escapism, but you've got to make it real as well too. And so it's just a matter of balance. And I think probably when I'm writing, it's a good question, Mandy. Probably I don't think I'm self-censoring, but I'm always conscious of balance. I don't want to make the violence so gratuitous that it turns people off. And I don't want to make the politics so horrible that people get bored of it, you know. Or so, but you know, it's just to keep it, I think, to keep the background as realistic as you can while you're telling a story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, a decent backdrop.
Yeah.
Janet says, I remember listening to an interview with Lee Child on ABC in Australia, and he said that if he knew what was going to happen in his books, he would find it too boring to write them. It sounds like you develop your plots in a similar manner. How does the sense of place in the Australian bush compare with what that in the southern, how does the sense of place in the Australian bush compare with that in Southern Africa?
Yeah, I think certainly I would agree with what Lee Child says. And that's what keeps me going, is I don't want to know how the book is going to end. I'm writing a book now for next year, and I don't know how to end it because I don't really want to. You know, when you're reading a book and you're enjoying it and you think, I don't want this book to end. Well, when I'm writing a book, I don't want it to end either. I don't want to know who the baddie is. I want to.
The problem is that Lee Child is a bad example. Because
Yeah.
you know that in a Lee Child book, he's going to march into town, rescue a damsel in distress, get thrown into jail, blow some shit up, shag somebody, and then leave town. So, I mean, that is a lead. I mean, like here is the formula, let's fit it in. But your books don't seem to follow the same sort of premise.
No, the other thing is I have a very strong motivator here when I write, and that is to fool my wife, because she is the sort of person who she'll pick up a book and she'll read the first chapter and she'll go, oh, I know what's going to happen in the end. And then she'll read the last chapter, you know, and I'm like, what are you doing? And she says, I said, why do you do that? She said, well, when I start reading a book, I know what's going to happen. And I said, so why do you read the ending straight away? And she says, just to prove I was right. And I said to her, the first time I saw her do this, I said, so were you right? She says, I'm always right. You know, that's to
read a cookery book. You never know how they're going to end.
Exactly. And then, so when I write, I'm also consciously thinking, how can I fool her as well? So if the end is a little bit surprising, good, because I'm working my
very surprising end.
I'm working my damnedest to fool my editors and my publishers. And when I was writing Last Survivor, my editor said, oh, I think I knew who it was going to be. And the publisher says, I think I knew who it was going to be, but I was wrong. And then the editor shuts up at that point because she doesn't want to say she's smarter than her boss, you know. the publisher, she's saying, oh, you had me there. I could never guess it. The editor's going, oh, I'm not so sure about that. But anyway, so I have a lot of good feedback to get that in. As to the Australian bush and the South African bush, like I said, I have this lifestyle where in Australia I live in the city, and you know what? Look, I mean, until I went to South Africa, the thought for me of going to a holiday in somewhere like the Lowveld, you know, which is the bush, and everything's got a barb on it, and it's full of snakes and things that want to kill you, and the nearest beach is 100 kilometers away. I'd say, you're joking. I'm not going to go somewhere like that for a holiday, because my experience of the bush in Australia, and I think this is part of it, was coloured by the army. So the only time I'd ever been into the bush in Australia was on army exercises. And anyone who's been in the army knows they pick the worst places in the world to conduct their exercises, because the reason nobody's living there is because of the worst places in the world. They're full of leeches and snakes and, you know, things that want to bite you and stuff like that.
Are you talking about people or animals?
No, but just, you know, so my experience of the bush was not pleasant. You know, I was never someone who would go for a bushwalk or go into the bush in Australia to have fun. So when I went to South Africa and found that the bush there also has, you know, lions and elephants and zebras and giraffes and all this amazing, interesting stuff, I got totally bowled over. And I think that my sense of place in the books is all about, I think certainly in the early books, is trying to capture the wonder that I felt of being, you know, in places like the Kruger Park and Wangi in Zimbabwe and Etosha in Namibia. And these days it's probably moved more towards wanting to talk about, you know, what we need to do to protect these places and protect the wildlife that's in there. And my knowledge as a tourist went from, oh, there's a rhino, isn't that great, to, oh, there's a rhino, I wonder who's out there trying to kill it, you know, and what's being done to protect it, and what are the government policies that might affect that. So yeah, so my sense of place, I think, has reflected the sense of involvement. So I'm far more passionate about what's going on in the African bush. But, you know, in Australia, I think it's fair to say that I've gained a greater appreciation of our own wildlife here, funnily enough, from spending time in Africa, because somebody asked a question. I was doing an interview the other day, am I passionate about the wildlife in Australia? Well, I'm certainly a lot more interested in it, because when where we grew up, when my wife and I grew up in Sydney, where she grew up in the 1960s and early 1970s, there were koalas where she lived on the coast, on the beach in Sydney, you know, in the built up areas. And of course there are none there now. And I would tell that story and she would tell that story, and you would say, oh, isn't that amazing, you know, that there were koalas there. Well, now I tell that story and I think that's disgusting, the fact that there aren't anymore. Like it is a national shame here in Australia, you know, that has happened, that those animals could very well go extinct. It's not curious, it's terrible, you know. And so one of the things I also try and do in the books, when I talk about the South African bush, and I know we've got some honorary rangers and people who were chatting to before, is I try and point out the good work that's being done, particularly in South Africa, because I think like any country in the world, you can get very easily dragged down by all the problems that you face. It happens here in Australia. We focus on the problems rather than the good stuff we've got. But it never ceases to amaze me that, you know, as we chat here, whether it's day or night, there are men and women literally putting their lives on the line to protect wildlife and the environment. In some cases, plants. There are armed rangers protecting plants in the Kruger Park. That's something that South Africa has to be incredibly proud of. And the fact that they have managed to hold the line in so many areas of conservation, while so many other parts of Africa and the wider world have dropped the ball. You know, and it's something that never ceases to inspire me. And that's the other thing you look for when you're writing a book, is inspiration.
Tony, speaking of inspiration, I don't know where your book is. It was on my desk when I started doing this. Oh, here we go. When I was reading funny of that, Sharmini, there actually are Cycads on the front cover. I don't know if you,
I don't know which one it is.
Bottom, just by the way. There were two covers for this book, I noticed. The one actually had a big Cycad in the corner. That I actually think there was a nicer cover in terms of that, but I'll come back to that. What I wanted to ask you in your acknowledgements, people like, I think Sandy, who's with us today, have actually paid to be characters in your book. Who do they pay that money to? Where does it go?
Yeah, one of the things I've been very lucky in the course of writing the books is here in Australia and also in South Africa, is that I've been invited to speak at a number of charity functions for various NGOs, various charities, many of whom deal with wildlife. And in Australia, I was very humbled and fortunate to be asked to be a patron of a charity called Painted Dog Conservation here, which is for the African wild dog. They do great work here in Australia, raising money to support conservation programs in Africa for wild dogs, and I get invited to talk at rhino functions and elephant functions and things, which is fantastic, and a number of charities that support human causes in Southern Africa as well. And I kind of cotton on to this idea. I think the first time I ever heard of it, I'd like to say it was my idea, but I did see Nelson DeMille had done it in the past, American writer who I'm a big fan of, is that people will pay money to charities. So Generally what happens is we'll have a charity auction and people will pay money, they will bid to have their name or the name of a loved one used as a character. And it's turned out to be a phenomenally successful way to raise money for good causes. Because even in my little books, I should add it up one day, but people are paying literally thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of rand to have their names used as characters in the book, and it all goes to good causes. Not to me, I hasten to add. It's a good thing to do, I find, because you mightn't think it, Mandy, but one of the hardest, well, certainly for me, one of the hardest things for me when I was first writing was thinking up names, thinking up names of characters that are believable and reflect the person and stuff like that. Well, it turns out that if you outsource it, if you rely on other people to pay money to charity, you get good names. Now, no offense to the John Smith or Jane Does out there in the audience, but John Smith and Jane Doe generally don't pay money to have their names used as characters. You get people with names like in some of my previous books, Sydney Chipchase was one, and Braden and Tate Quilter Phipps. These are sort of names that you find in a Robert Smith book. They're like fantastic names, like Storm Courtney and things like that. But people with interesting names tend to want to spend money. So Sandy is Cassandra Burrell, which is a lovely, strong name, which reflects her very strong and feisty character in the book. And it helps a good cause as well too. So I'm really pleased to say that I think in Last Survivor, pretty well every character, I've got a waiting list, pretty well every character in there is someone somewhere in the world who has paid some good money to support a good cause. So I think it's fantastic. I'm really, really pleased to be part of that.
Sandy, can I ask you a question? How do you feel about being a gun-toting granny hanging out of the side of a helicopter, firing at people on the ground? While I wait for you to answer, I'm going to say, Charmony wants to ask, how do you choose your book covers? And when I saw this, I had no idea it was about Cycads. I would love a close-up of a Cycad. Why are there two different covers?
Well, there's a couple of different covers. And then also publishers have different priorities and things. So this is your cover, your version, the South African cover, in which my name is nice and big, and there's a Cycad down there. So they try to get a little bit of everything in there. And my name's bigger there is because I think, in the fiction world, I'm probably better known in South Africa than I am in Australia. I'm very proud to say, I will say this, I don't want to sound big-headed, but I was #1 in South Africa the last 2 weeks. Thank you, South Africa. Thank you very much. In Australia, my own country, where I'm not so well known, my name is very small, but the name of the book is bigger. And then I don't have the UK US edition with me as well, but that's got a completely different look because it's destined for the US. It's got a lady with a big gun on the front.
Yes, they need that.
Authors don't have a lot of input into the covers. It's very much driven by the publishers and the market and what they think will sell. And I'm lucky. I think I have pretty good designers. A bigger Cycad, yeah, maybe. Yeah. Because I want to appeal to all of the Cycad fans out there. At least
I remember when I was researching, one of the covers had a giant Cycad in the bottom right-hand corner. I don't know if I've still got the. I don't know if I've still got.
That's probably the US. That's the US UK version. Yeah. And the lady on the front with the big gun as well too. So
yeah, and I didn't notice the lady. I did notice the plant. I haven't.
You've got to try and get. You want the cover to, I think, represent as much as you can about the book, as well as be eye-catching and as well as drag people in. It's a very tricky business. It's a skill set all of its own, and it's something where they come to me and say, "Do you like that cover?" And I say yes, and they say, "Do you like that cover?" And I say yes. Yeah.
Have you ever said no?
The only funny thing I said once was no to was a funny story that I'll tell you. There's a book called The Delta, which is the first book that Sonia appears in, Sonia Kurtz. If you have a look at this picture, there's a lovely picture of a lion in Botswana in the Okavango Delta. And I said to them, is that real? And they said, yeah, and it was. And I Googled it. It's a real picture of a big male lion wading through the water. And my publisher said, well, what do you think of it? I said, well, there's a little problem. And she said, what's that? Because I normally don't argue the toss. And I said, he's got no pom-pom. I said, where's his pom-pom? And, I was talking about the tuft of the tail, which has been added in there. I don't know if it has a technical name. And she said, but we're doing this via email. And she says, pom-pom. She said, "Is that what you call it?" And I said, "Well," in my email it says, I don't know what the technical name is, but we call it a pom-pom." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Oh, we removed it." And I said, "What do you remove? Why would you remove the pom-pom?" And she says, "Are we talking about the same thing?" And then I found out what she was talking about is this big fellow here. Let me tell you, in the original picture, was so big and loud and proud that there was absolutely no doubt that he was a male lion. And I'm not talking about the mane, okay? He was anatomically correct in every sense of the word, this guy. So they airbrushed him out. And I said, no, because he had no tip on his tail. So I was talking about the pom-pom. And so when the picture came through, it looked like that with no tuft on the head. But we both worked out we were talking about two completely different things. And then I emailed her a few pictures of lions showing the tuft. So they airbrushed out one part of him, which I won't name, and they had to airbrush in a tuft or a pom-pom on the end of his, because they were worried about offending the sensitive readers of Australia. But it was quite noticeable, I will tell you.
I agree with you, Barbara. Pom-pom will now take on a new meaning. So are there pom-poms on your brinjal, we shall say these days? You know. Sandy responded. She said, "I totally love it. Enjoyed my role. Tony did an awesome job."
Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely. Sandy's been such a huge supporter of mine. She lives in Western Australia, and it's one thing I do like to point out in the back of the books is not just all the people who've paid to have their names in the book, but I am incredibly grateful to all of the friends and supporters that I've made through the books, and to everybody who bothers to read a book, whether they borrow it from their local library or buy a copy for themselves, because it's quite humbling. And particularly, you know, you're in South Africa as an Australian who has chosen to make his other home in South Africa. Really, for me, it's humbling, and I would have to say there's probably no more gratifying thing I can hear than if someone in South Africa has liked the book. So I get a lot of emails, and they quite often start off with, "When I found out that you were an Australian writing books set in Africa, I thought this book is going to be, you know, some expletive, you know, whatever." And usually there's a but after that. And they said that they liked the book, which for me is great, because I'm conscious that I'm writing about, although I live there, I'm conscious I'm writing about other people's cultures and sensitive issues sometimes in places where people have lived. But at the end of the day, I hope that people will just get some entertainment out of the book. So with Last Survivor, I put a little bit more humor in there than usual. But funnily enough,
very dry. Your humor is very dry. You could almost be an Englishman, you know. And when Sonia's relationship with Hudson Brand, you know, like, come on, girlfriend. I don't know any women like that. Well, I suppose I know one or two, but they're not the norm. Yeah.
Very dry. I had a funny email from an academic who helped me with the Cycad side of things. And he said he liked the book. But the other thing is, I thought that I had gone to town a bit too much with some of the members of the Cycad and Firearms Appreciation Society. I thought they might have been a little bit pushing the envelope. But he says, "I think I can identify all of those people. I think I know who they are from his real life Cycad Society group." So it was very affirming and very humbling as well.
I was about to say goodbye to you, but there's a question, and it's actually a very interesting question. Are you a South African citizen? If not, how are you able to spend 6 months here each year?
Yeah, my wife and I have, we've got temporary residency. So we've got a 4-year temporary residency visa, which is about to run out in April. So we have to get back to South Africa and get to Home Affairs to extend our visa. And before that, I had working visa. As an author, I was able to get an exceptional skills working visa. Now I'm on a different class of visa, but my aim is to get permanent residency. I would like to do that. I have 2 aims. My first aim is to get permanent residency, and I think if I can do that just before that happens, I will learn how to sing the national anthem. I think that's very important as well too, if you're going to be a resident of a country as well too, because I love South Africa. I'm a fan of the region, you know. I love Zimbabwe. My wife and I have recently invested in a safari lodge in Wangi.
Very brave.
But yeah, or stupid maybe. But our heart is definitely in South Africa, and particularly in the Lowveld, which funnily enough is the first place we ever visited. And we have so many friends there, and we feel for what people are going through at the moment. I really do. I know everyone around the world is doing it tough in one way or another, but I know how hard things can be in South Africa. But I also know that there is probably no, in my mind, friendlier part of the world or no other place where I feel as at home as I do is in the African bush, and I can't wait to get back.
Well, we look forward to having you back soon. Karen says, is your friend Damien Mander in the IAPF? He has the female anti-poaching force in Zim.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I know Damien. He and I have met quite a few times. And I had an all-female anti-poaching unit in the Cull, which actually predated Damien's, I must say, because the first all-female anti-poaching unit was the Black Mambas up in the Baluli area of up near Hoedspruit. And so they were the real trailblazers. But Damien has done phenomenal work with his ladies up in Zimbabwe as well, too. So he's a very committed guy. And yeah, so I think there's, like I say, there are a lot of good people doing a lot of good work on the ground, and long may that continue. And in particular, the South African Honorary Rangers, because I've had some dealings with them and hope to be addressing a couple of meetings, which I won't be able to now. But I am a huge fan of the good work that they and the whole Ranger Corps does in South Africa.
Well, that's fantastic. Tony, I can't thank you enough for spending the evening with us, your evening, my morning. Thank you so much. The book is an absolute treat. It's a real romp. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it last night. I especially waited. I didn't want to read it too far in advance, so I finished it last night at about 11 o'clock, and I did. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's very different kind of read and very exciting. And you did. You got me in the end. Because I did wonder a little bit, and then I thought, okay, I'll just go with it for now, and then you switched text, which was fantastic. So thank you for that.
Thanks, man. Been lovely, and thanks for everyone's attendance, and thanks for everyone's questions as well too. I really appreciate
thank you very much. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you very much, Tony. Everybody else, the program will come out later in the week, and otherwise we look forward to seeing you on Sunday with Jeremy Dronfeld and the boy who followed his father into Auschwitz. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.